For some reason, somebody left a book up here which has the title Human Capability. I guess there's a reason, but I've been here for 24 hours about in Austin, and I've seen some remarkable examples of it. The level of activism, organization, energy, spirit is really impressive. I do plenty of traveling, and there are a lot of things happening all over the country and all over the world, but I think it'd be pretty hard to duplicate what I've been able to experience here. It really is an inspiration and a hope for the future. So human capability is right. Let me begin by talking a bit about the expectations of the people with real power, both their expectations for the world in general and then turning to the Middle East specifically in that broader context. So begin with the gentleman from Crawford discussing what's called the war on terror. Kind of a side remark is that he is using, and I will reluctantly be using, the word terror in a technical sense. That's not in accord with its actual meaning or even its official definition in the U.S. Code and Army manuals, but a technical sense in which the term terror is restricted to the use of terror by them against us and excludes another category, namely the terror that we and our clients and allies carry out against whoever they may be, which is often much worse. This technical usage is universal and unchallengeable, and I'll keep to it, as I said, reluctantly, but I should emphasize that even to talk about a war on terror is a real display of extraordinary hypocrisy and moral cowardice, and the fact that it's universal doesn't change that fact. Well, with that said, I want you to understand that if I ever talk about terror. So talking about the so-called war on terror, the President said, "There's no telling how many wars it will take to secure freedom in the homeland," which is fair enough. There are potential threats everywhere, and they're virtually limitless, and they're in fact right here. The anthrax scare is a good example, traced back to federal laboratories, so there's plenty of places to bomb if we want to bomb. It's worth paying attention to what's said about these matters by the people with the most experience. So take the head of Shabak, the Israeli secret, not secret, the services that run the occupied territories. What I notice are called in Austin the disputed territories. They're disputed by the U.S. government and the media and nobody else. So I'll call them what they are, the occupied territories. He's the guy who ran them up until 2000. He said that those who want victory against terror want an unending war unless they are willing to address underlying grievances. He's, of course, speaking about Israel-Palestine, where the only solution of the problem of terror is to offer an honorable solution to Palestinians, respecting their rights of self-determination. Actually, that's a quote from a predecessor of his, the former head of Israeli military intelligence, Yehoshaphat Harkabi, also a leading Arabist, and that's 20 years ago. He was speaking after another outbreak of shocking army settler violence in the occupied territories. That was a time, 20 years ago, when Israel retained its immunity from retaliation from within the territories to its harsh and brutal and degrading practices there. And that immunity lasted until very recently, so it wasn't the terror that was going on wasn't considered a problem in the United States or the West. Well, these observations generalize in some rather obvious ways. In serious scholarship, at least, it's recognized universally, as far as I know, I'll quote one example, that unless the social, political, and economic conditions that spawned al-Qaeda and other associated groups are addressed, the United States and its allies will continue to be targeted by Islamic terrorists. There will be an unending war. And as the CIA pointed out just a couple of weeks ago, and you didn't need an intelligence service to tell you this because it's trivially obvious, the only anticipated terror expected to be linked to Iraq is Saddam's likely reaction to an invasion. And worst case analysis of that is, which is not entirely implausible, could be pretty horrendous. So there are ways to increase terrorism, if that's what we want to do, namely the ways that are being planned and implemented relentlessly in Washington and Crawford. And they know it and they understand why, which tells you how much they care about terrorism. They also know how to deal with it, namely in accord with the recommendations of the people I've just been quoting, including the CIA and Israeli intelligence. It's also important to pay some attention not only to Washington's absolutely massive contribution to international terrorism over the years and continuing, but also to its critical role in establishing the terrorist networks that later on turned against the West. That's well known, or certainly should be well known in the case of al-Qaeda, too well known to talk about. So take a less discussed case, the recent terrorist atrocities in Bali. It's been less discussed here, that is, it's very much discussed among experts on the region in Australia, where they pay close attention to these matters, quite pretty obvious reasons. It's generally supposed that the terrorist attack in Bali traces back to Jamaat Islamiyah, and that may be true. So let's assume that it's true, the general assumption. Well, what is that? That's one of the Muslim extremist groups that were formed with the backing of General Suharto, with the firm support of the United States, and the purpose was to link the army, the major terrorist force in Indonesia, as in most countries, to link the army to Muslim extremists. That's what lay behind horrendous terrorist atrocities back in 1965, in which Bali was some of the worst. It's not a peacekeeping, it's not a peaceful paradise the way it was described. The atrocities of 1965, New York Times called them staggering mass slaughter. Time magazine, big front page about a boiling bloodbath. The CIA described it as mass murder comparable to Hitler, Stalin, and Mao. Bali was the worst place, and it was grew out of a linkage that had been established between Muslim extremist groups and the Indonesian army, all backed fully by the United States, and in fact greeted with complete euphoria in the United States and the West generally, considered a marvelous achievement, hope where there once was none, gleam of light in Asia, quoting some headlines in the New York Times and elsewhere. It was wonderful. They killed maybe 1 million people, mostly landless peasants, and poor people, destroyed the main mass-based popular party in the country, a party of the poor that eliminated the threat of democracy, which had been a big concern for a long time. So this was just a fantastic mass slaughter comparable to Hitler, Stalin, and Mao, according to the CIA. Bali was the worst place, and it was traceable to that linkage that had been established with U.S. support. Well, those links probably continue. in fact surely continue, and may be, as some Australian specialists are arguing, linked to or in the background of the latest Bali atrocity. General Suharto went on to compile one of the worst human rights records in the world. He's fully comparable to Saddam Hussein, and he remained our kind of guy, as the Clinton administration described him in 1995, just as Saddam was our kind of guy, described as a nice moderate by George Bush #1 and most of the people in power in Washington now, right through his worst atrocities and beyond. So there's a lot that's familiar in everything that's happening if we want to pay attention. Well, going back to the expectations of the powerful, Middle East and more generally, one good source to look at, I really urge it if it's a public document, if you want to find out about this, is a document called Global Trends 2015. It was released by the U.S. National Intelligence Council. That's the CIA, the DIA, the whole assorted intelligence agencies, with inputs from academic specialists and the corporate world. This is pre-9/11. This is back in year 2000. They have a lot of long analysis of what they expect to happen for the next 15 years. Nothing much has changed after September 11th except new pretexts. The main prediction that they make is what they call globalization, specific form of international economic integrations called globalization in the propaganda system. They predict that globalization will continue on course, I'm quoting it. Its evolution will be rocky, marked by chronic financial volatility and a widening economic divide. Okay, that's the prediction. Those of you who've taken Econ 101 know that in theory globalization is supposed to lead to convergence, to single integrated market with a single wage and price. So what they're actually predicting is less globalization in the technical sense, but more globalization in the doctrinally preferred sense, which means that the people who matter will make out like bandits, and that the rest, it's not our department. The increasing financial volatility, that means slower growth, harming mainly the poor. So that's the optimistic prediction. Those projections actually extend previous tendencies. This, it's usually called outside the United States the neoliberal period, the period that's here called globalization, the last 20, 25 years, has been marked by a very significant deterioration in just about every measure of economic development, rate of growth, productivity growth, investment, even trade. There are some exceptions, namely countries that didn't follow the rules, but where the rules were followed most rigorously in places like Latin America, it's the worst disaster. And in most of the world, including the United States, it's been a very poor period, certainly as compared with the preceding 25 years. And they're expecting that to continue and in fact extend, with a widening economic divide and slower growth resulting from more financial volatility. Military planners make the same assumptions, and they're also available in public documents, which you really should read. So Clinton planners, just like this was, published a document a couple of years ago called Vision for 2020. And it predicts, this is the Space Command, the guys who are in charge of, putting up murderous weapons in space that'll probably do us all in. They predict a growing gap between the haves and the have-nots. And they say the have-nots will become, that's the widening economic divide. The have-nots will become disruptive. They're going to have to be controlled in the interests of what's called stability, which means shutting up and following orders. It's a technical term for it in the political science literature. The National Intelligence Council, when they describe it, what they say is that as globalization proceeds, deepening stagnation will foster political, ethnic, ideological, and religious extremism, along with violence, much of it directed against the United States. That's the optimistic prediction. And they understand the reasons. I mean, just mention the reasons. That's part of the motive between the vast expansion of U.S. military power. And although it's shooting up now, remember what it was before September 11th. I mean, before September 11th, U.S. military force completely outweighed any imaginable combination of allies or adversaries. And those measures are quite misleading because they don't count a lot of things. They don't count offshore U.S. military bases, which is in effect what Israel is now. It's decided some years ago to become an offshore U.S. military base. And although it's a small country, that means it has huge military force. According to the IDF, the Israeli Army analysts, the air and naval forces of Israel are larger and more advanced than those of any NATO power, except for the United States, and the armored forces as well. In NATO itself, the major, aside from the U.S., the major military power is Britain. About 40 years ago, senior U.S. statesman secretly described Britain as, in his words, our lieutenant. The fashionable word is partner. The British are supposed to hear the fashionable word, but in Washington they understand the real word. That's fundamentally part of the U.S. military system, too. And we can go on. Turkey, others. Count these things. It's a military system of incredible power. 9/11 provided a pretext for increasing the military spending very sharply. This is totally unrelated to terrorism, but it's very closely related to global control and even to maintaining the advanced economy. The Space Command, which I quoted, explains this pretty well in Visions 2020. They give a little historical background, which is not unrealistic. They point out that in the past centuries, countries developed armies and navies to protect, first of all, for self-defense, like in places like in the United States, you needed an army for self-defense against those who were called the merciless Indian savages who were carrying out terror against the peaceful colonists. I'm quoting the Declaration of Independence, which you have a famous document. So we needed an army for self-defense in places like Austin, for instance, named after one of the well-known defenders. They also needed navies and air forces, as the Space Command points out, to protect commercial interests and investments. And they say, well, the next obvious frontier is space, so we got to move on to militarization of space. But they say this is going to be different than in the past. So when the British built a huge navy, incidentally, on the basis of the biggest narco-trafficking enterprise in history by far. This is an interesting story, but I won't go into it. The British built a huge navy, and Germany was able to counter it. And we know what that happened. That's the first half of the 20th century. You don't have to talk about that. But this time it's going to be different because the United States is going to have a monopoly over militarization of space. Nobody's going to counter it. U.S. force will be so enormous that there won't be any competitors, and if anybody tries to raise their heads, gets cut off very fast, along with anybody else who's in the neighborhood. This is back in 1997, I'm quoting, right? Not after 9/11. And it's all public documents. You can read it. The goal will be to militarize space in order to, with total control, in order to protect U.S. interests and investments, and of course to control those have-nots as the deepening stagnation and the widening economic divide fosters extremist violence. So we have to have a war on terror, meaning a terrorist war, of course. That's what words mean. The most ominous of the plans, which are announced, is in fact the militarization of space, placing highly destructive weapons in space on hair-trigger alert, which is a virtual guarantee of destruction, if only by accident. The world is well aware of this. Over the last several years, there have been repeated efforts in the General Assembly of the United Nations to reaffirm the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, which reserves space for peaceful uses. It passes overwhelmingly every year with the United States and Israel abstaining. Sometimes they pick up Micronesia or somebody like that. And the reason for it, the reason for the reaffirmation is everyone knows the United States is intending to violate it by militarizing space, which is extraordinarily dangerous, and nobody likes it. It's kept silent here, so you don't read anything about it. And it's a reasonable, too. It's not a good idea to let citizens know of plans that may end biology's only experiment with what's called higher intelligence. A lot of this is disguised under missile defense. But when you hear the word defense, you immediately think offense. That should be a reflex. And that's what it means in this case, too. Ballistic missile defense is not intended for defensive purposes. Pentagon advisors and Chinese military experts actually use the same words to describe it. They describe ballistic missile defense, quoting the RAND Corporation, as not simply a shield, but an enabler of U.S. action, permits the U.S. to act freely without any concerns. More quotes. It provides, if it works, it would provide, even if anyone thinks it works, doesn't really have to, it would provide the United States with absolute freedom in using or threatening to use force in international relations, cementing U.S. hegemony, and making Americans the masters of the world. I'm quoting military analysts in both the liberal and the conservative press. There's not much difference. That's the reasoning that lies behind the long-term geopolitical planning that was just announced in the Bush administration's national strategic document. They do represent an extreme position on the ideological spectrum, but you've got to bear in mind that it's a pretty narrow spectrum, as these pre-Bush II documents and commentary reveals, and there's a much earlier history. Well, there's plenty more to say about that topic, but I'll put it aside and turn to the more immediate question: how does the Middle East fall into this picture? Let's think about it in that general framework, which I think is the right one. The National Intelligence Council, which I was quoting, of course, has a lot to say about the Middle East. They say that there will be a rising demand for energy, and they point out that that's going to undermine the Kyoto protocols, whether anybody signs it or not, and will lead, they predict, to more rapid global warming, which is another threat to survival, but kind of rational within a lunatic framework in which planning goes on. Speaking of the Persian Gulf region, they say that's the main energy resource of the world, has been known to be for years. The Persian Gulf region will see large increases in oil production capacity and will rise in importance to the world energy market. So it follows that the United States has to control it, as it has done since World War II, when it kicked out France and reduced Britain to our lieutenant. They also point out that the United States itself is not going to rely on energy from that source. The U.S. will use more secure sources in the Atlantic Basin, meaning Latin America and West Africa. But that doesn't change anything. That's been true since the issue is not access to oil, and never has been. That's been true since World War II. Everybody in Texas, at least, ought to know that the United States, North America, was the largest producer, the largest oil producer, right up to about 1970. Wasn't using Middle East oil and still doesn't need it if it doesn't want it. But nevertheless, during this period, the U.S. had to control the Persian Gulf. Didn't care about the oil, it wanted to control it. And there are good reasons for that. Back in the 1940s. The State Department pointed out that Persian Gulf oil is the greatest material prize in world history and a stupendous source of strategic power, and went on to explain that. Well, the greatest material prize in history means that whoever controls it gets profits beyond the dreams of avarice, to quote standard history of the industry. And that doesn't mean just oil company profits. It also means tons of petrodollars flowing right back into the U.S. economy, propping it up. A lot of it goes to military industry, which is a cover for high-tech industry, into Treasury securities and so on. So you got to control it because of the profits beyond the dreams of avarice. But also it's a stupendous source of strategic power, and that's crucial. Strategic power means it's a lever of world control. You have your hands on Persian Gulf oil, you control the world. It provides what George Kennan 50 years ago called veto power over others that might decide to get out of line. So it's not a matter of access to oil. You can have that, with contracts. It's not a problem. It's a matter of who controls it. And the U.S. has to control this stupendous source of strategic power. How do you control it? The British used to run that region primarily, and they had a way. Their internal documents are also available, so we know about their planning. This goes now back to the First World War, around the time when the world was shifting to an oil-based economy, and it was known that the Middle East is a huge treasure. The British had a device. The idea was to let the so-called countries, and so-called is the right word, be administered by what they called an Arab facade. An Arab facade means weak, pliable, corrupt, brutal states that take care of local administration, but have to be weak enough so the British can really run the show. And as they put it, British control will be veiled by constitutional fictions as a protectorate or a sphere of influence or buffer states. That has to be quoting Lord Curzon during the First World War. This method was considered more cost-effective than direct occupation, military occupation. Same was true of air power. Remember, right after World War I, air power was sort of coming to be available as for police action. That's not for wars at that time. It's a device for controlling populations, and also considered more effective than direct ground forces. So Winston Churchill, I'm told George Bush has a bust of Churchill facing him on his desk, given to him by his Lieutenant Tony Blair. Churchill was in a high position in the War and Colonial Department in those days. He advised use of poison gas against uncivilized tribes. And he spoke with contempt about the squeamishness of those who are raising questions about using what was then considered the most criminal weapon of war. He said it would spread a lively terror among those who are chafing under British rule, recalcitrant Arabs, as they were called by the High Command. That referred mostly to Kurds and Afghans, incidentally. The murderous bombing of civilians was justified on the same grounds. That's the way you keep them under control. That meant that Britain had to undermine international conventions, trying to restrict the use of air power against civilians. It was setting precedents which are followed by its successor in world control. There's nothing new about what's going on now. And it was understood, again, in secret. So in 1932, Britain succeeded in undermining an international convention to eliminate the use of air power as a terror weapon against civilians. And the distinguished statesman Lloyd George, highly respected, wrote in his diary that this was a great achievement because, in his words, we must reserve the right to bomb niggers. That's a fundamental moral principle, and fundamental moral principles are long-lasting, so it survives. You got to reserve the right to bomb niggers. Then it was air power, now it may be something else, but that's necessary in the civilized world. Well, the U.S. took over the British model after the Second World War and extended it. It added another level of control, which is very crucial for understanding what's happening. The U.S. introduced regional powers, which would be, as the Nixon administration called them, local cops on the beat. Police headquarters is in Washington, and there's a branch office in London, but the local cops on the beat are supposed to protect the Arab facade, not against the Russians, against their own populations, the main problem. Their own populations, remember, are uncivilized tribes. They can't get simple things through their heads. You know, they don't understand why the wealth of the region should flow to the west and a small groups of corrupt gangsters instead of being used for them. They just never seem to understand that, and that's one of the reasons we have to reserve the right to bomb niggers. If the administration, if the local facade can't do it and the regional cops on the beat aren't up to the task. Local cops on the beat back then were Turkey, which has been since the Second World War, Iran, after the U.S. succeeded in reversing its effort to take control of its own resources, and U.S. and Britain reinstalled the Shah back in 1953. So it was a local cop, very loyal until it got out of control in '79. And in fact, U.S.-Israeli relations developed in this context. That's how they developed, and that's how they remain. That's worth looking at the history. In 1948, the Joint Chiefs of Staff were quite impressed with Israel's military victory, and they described Israel as second only to Turkey as a military force in the region and potentially useful for U.S. power in this system of regional control. 10 years later, in 1958, which is a time of turmoil I'll come back to, the U.S. intelligence advised that a logical corollary, they said, of our opposition to Arab nationalism, then secular nationalism, a logical corollary of our opposition to Arab nationalism is support for Israel as the one really reliable base for U.S. power in the region. That was 1958. I didn't do much about it then, it's in the back of their minds, but in 1967, that was demonstrated. Israel succeeded in destroying one of the main center of Arab nationalism, Nasser's Egypt, which was also one of the centers of the hated non-aligned movement. Hated is an understatement, despised non-aligned movement. Egypt was one of the centers. Israel managed to destroy it. That's when the U.S.-Israel alliance really took off, and the love affair of American intellectuals with Israel took off as well, in recognition of Israel's success in using violence to bomb niggers. I mean, it's put in more humanitarian terms because intellectuals like that, but if you look at the history, that's what it was about. We should remember, a side comment here, that the United States is a global power, and we mislead ourselves if we look too closely at one region of the world. If something's happening in one place, chances are strong it's happening in other places. That's what global powers are. That's what it means to be a global power. And that was true in this case as well. So in 1967, Israel destroyed one of the centers of the non-aligned movement, and as I just mentioned a couple of minutes ago, the alliance of the Indonesian army and Muslim extremists with U.S. backing destroyed another center of the non-aligned movement, namely in Indonesia, which was the second major center. The third center was India, and things were happening there too, but not much time, so I'll go into it later if you like. But anyway, these two centers were destroyed. That was a great achievement. That's why there was such euphoria, and that firmed up the U.S.-Israel alliance. In Indonesia, let's go back a little bit, back to 1958 again, when the logical corollary was announced. 1958 happens to be an extremely important year in modern history. We now know a lot about it from declassified documents and so on. The Eisenhower administration in 1958 internally identified three major crises in the world: Indonesia, North Africa, and the Middle East. All oil producers, all Islamic. They stressed, emphasized vociferously that it had nothing to do with the Russians. The Russians weren't involved anywhere. It had to do with the usual problem, indigenous nationalism. The niggers don't get the point, and you got to use force. That was the problem in the three areas. In the case of Indonesia, and the Eisenhower administration acted in all of them, importantly, in Indonesia they tried to, they carried out the biggest clandestine operation in post-war history. The idea was to support a revolt in Indonesia, a military revolt, which would strip away the outer islands, break the country up. The outer islands are where most of the resources were. That didn't work. The U.S. then turned to supporting the military. That's the standard way to overthrow a civilian government, support the military, like Chile, elsewhere, usually works. That's ultimately what led to the 1965 military coup and the staggering mass slaughter comparable to Hitler, Stalin, and Mao, which was greeted with enormous euphoria, as I mentioned, for one reason, primary reason, because it eliminated the threat of democracy. Back in 1958, there was deep concern that the party of the poor, based on the peasantry, was growing in political power. Indonesia was just too democratic, and that had to be stopped. They had to be exterminated. That was achieved in 1965, and there was no more threat, and hence the euphoria in the West, liberal circles and elsewhere. That was Indonesia in 1965. One of the three crises was fixed by the coup. Israel took care of the second crisis by destroying the center of Arab nationalism. And the third one, North Africa, was taken care of by itself when Algeria won independence. And then comes another story, which I won't go into. Well, going back to the Middle East itself, incidentally, similar things were happening at the same time in India and Latin America and elsewhere. You really have to focus on Washington if you want to understand what's going on, not on one particular region. Going back to the Middle East, as I said, U.S. relations with Israel developed in this context. I won't run through the details. In 1979, those relations became still more firm when Iran disappeared from the local COPS category, went off on its own, became part of what's called the axis of evil, meaning independent. The relations between Israel and Turkey, on the other hand, became much more strong, all within the U.S. framework. I mentioned the strength of the Israeli air and naval forces. Around over 10% of them are reported now to be based permanently in Turkey. The Air Force is flying along the Iranian border, getting ready for the next war, the one that comes after you take care of Iraq, and the Iranians certainly know it. There are also armored forces there which are necessary in Turkey in case it becomes, it's required once again, as in the last few years, to carry out huge atrocities against their own Kurdish population, some of the worst atrocities of the 1990s, for which Clinton bears primary responsibility, poured arms in as the atrocities mounted. And American intellectuals helped by keeping quiet about it. You don't read about it in the media, but you can easily find out. And that might be necessary again, so advanced armored forces are necessary along with air and naval forces. This alliance, this kind of Israel, Turkey, alliance, Azerbaijan a minor partner, India now joining, now that it's been taken over by an extremist right-wing nationalist government, which is also very murderous, so it's joining into the alliance, and Pakistan is kind of an uneasy partner. That's the system that's evolving. These are looking back over the years, these are the primary reasons why the United States has been blocking any diplomatic settlement to the Israel-Palestine conflict since actually 1971. In 1971, Egypt offered a full peace settlement, precisely in accord with U.S. formal policy. Didn't say anything about the Palestinians, just full peace in return for Israeli occupation of the Sinai, Egyptian territory. That was debated in Washington, and one of Kissinger's reasons he got the Nobel Prize, I guess, is that he succeeded in blocking it. He succeeded in imposing what he called stalemate. Stalemate means no negotiations, no diplomacy, just reliance on force, which they thought at that time they had total monopoly of, and people just ridiculed Arab force. So they rejected Sadat's offer, even rejected it after he kicked out Russian advisors. Sadat, president of Egypt at the time, he kept warning that if the U.S. continues to block peace and Israel continues to settle in the Sinai, as they were then doing up in the northeastern Sinai, one of Sharon's contributions, very brutal, that if that happened, they were just going to have to resort to war. Nobody took them seriously. In 1973, they did resort to war. It turned out to be a very close thing, came close to a nuclear war. U.S. Kissinger got the point, clouds lifted. He then moved towards the backup strategy of accepting the Egyptian offer. That's what happened in Camp David in 1978-79. Jimmy Carter just got a Nobel Prize for having finally agreed to accept the 1971 offer after years of bloodshed and destruction. It's called a triumph of American diplomacy, in fact, a catastrophe of diplomacy, but properly reinterpreted. The 1978 acceptance of Egypt's offer long-standing offer to have a peace treaty with Israel if Israel withdrew from Sinai, from the Egyptian territories. That was recognized right away in Israel by strategic analysts, and it's obvious if you think about it. It was recognized as a very, although they didn't want to give up the Sinai, as a very important step forward. It eliminated the Arab deterrent. Egypt was the sole Arab military force that could deter anything that the United States and Israel wanted to do. And remember, when you hear that Israel's doing something, that's wrong. It's the U.S. and Israel who are doing it. Israel can't make a move without U.S. backing and authorization. It's a client state. When you eliminate the Arab deterrent, as Israeli analysts pointed out at once, that frees Israel with U.S. backing to move to extend settlement in the occupied territories, to integrate them within Israel, and to attack their northern neighbor. Okay, they're now free to do it, no deterrent. It's exactly what happened. First invasion of Lebanon was in 1978, right in the middle of Camp David. The big invasion, Sharon invasion, was 1982, killed about 20,000 people. There was no pretext even of self-defense. Nobody even talked about it. The purpose, quote the Chief of Staff, Raful Eitan, was to destroy the PLO as a candidate for negotiations with us about the land of Israel. The land of Israel means the occupied territories. The purpose was to undermine the possibility of diplomatic moves, which the PLO was annoyingly putting forward. And the way to do that was to invade Lebanon and destroy them. 20,000 corpses, a real triumph for Sharon and Reagan, the Reaganites, the guys in Washington now, the same ones, who authorized it, supported it, vetoed Security Council resolutions to block it, and so on. Notice that that's a textbook illustration of international terrorism. if not outright aggression, which is a much worse crime. Well, going back a little, in 1976, the United States became more isolated in the diplomatic arena. The Security Council debated a resolution calling for what has been, ever since then, a very broad international consensus on settling the problem, namely a two-state settlement on the international border, maybe minor modifications. It was supported by virtually the whole world, supported strongly by the Arab states, by the Palestinians. Israel opposed it. They reacted by refusing to attend the UN session, instead bombing Lebanon, killing about 50 people. It was reported, no pretext. It was reported, but it's not terrorism. It's our ally, so just something that happened. The U.S. reacted by vetoing the resolution. It was vetoed again in 1980, the same one. Notice that a U.S. veto is, in fact, a double veto. It's important to realize that. First of all, it blocks the action, but it also wipes it out of history. Okay, so it doesn't exist in history. Try to read about it, it didn't happen. That's rather important. There's a lot of talk now about violation of UN resolutions, like Iraq, violates all kind of UN resolutions. I mean, if Iraq had veto power, it wouldn't be in violation of anything. If you really want to talk about violation of resolutions, you have to look at the veto. Now, that's the best way to violate a UN resolution. Just block it. And if it's the United States, wipe it out of history too. So if we're serious and talk about violating resolutions, we should be looking at the record of the vetoes. And that's very straightforward. There's nothing controversial about it. Since decolonization, when the UN became more representative of world opinion, and since the reconstruction from the destruction of the Second World War, roughly since the 1960s, the U.S. is far in the lead in vetoing Security Council resolutions on a whole variety of topics, all sorts of things. In second place is Britain, and nobody else is even within shouting distance. So that's the main violation of UN resolutions. There's some talk about Israel's violations, which is true, but minor in comparison, and beside the Israeli violations are really U.S. violations again. All of this is, of course, suppressed or denied in public commentary, but as I say, the facts are absolutely straightforward. There's nothing controversial about them. And it continues right to the present. So this year, there's been talk about what's called the Saudi plan, ratified by the Arab states last March. The Saudi plan is nothing new. It's a reiteration of the Saudi plan of 1981, which was blocked by the Reagan administration. Israel was opposed. And that itself was just a reiteration of the 1976 Security Council resolution that the U.S. vetoed. And in fact, in one form or another, it's the same plan that's all over the place. A two-state settlement on the international border, maybe minor rectifications here and there. It's an overwhelming international consensus, has been for a long time. It actually happens to be supported by the U.S. public. So if you look at polls, about 2/3 of the population supports what they call the Saudi plan. Roughly the same proportion of the population thinks the United States ought to be more involved in the diplomacy of the Middle East. Now, people don't know that that's a self-contradiction. It's precisely U.S. involvement that has prevented this plan from being implemented for 25 years. But you can't know that unless you carry out an independent research project, or unless you're part of the Palestine Solidarity Organization or some other activist group. If you somehow manage to get around the doctrinal system in the schools and the universities and the media and so on, then you can know that it's a contradiction. But most people don't have that luxury. One of the tasks of organizing is to give them that luxury. That's a plan which has been on the table for 25 years, still is, supported by the majority of the population here as elsewhere, and it could be implemented. Well, Clinton made some moves on that. He rescinded international law and UN resolutions, His administration declared them to be, at the UN, obsolete and anachronistic. Then comes the Oslo, what's called here the Oslo peace process, which changed the modalities but maintained the concepts. And we know what the concepts were. So let's go to the dovish side. Ehud Barak, who was the, Camp David, was the supposedly dovish negotiator, right next to Bill Clinton, the two peacemakers. His chief negotiator was Shlomo Ben-Ami. He's considered a dove in the Israeli spectrum. He's an academic historian. And just before he joined the Barak government, ended up being foreign minister, he wrote a book in Hebrew, 1998, in which he discussed the Oslo process. And he pointed out, quite accurately, that the goal of the Oslo process is to establish a neo-colonial dependency for Palestinians in the occupied territories, which would be permanent. Okay, so a permanent neo-colonial dependency. It's very similar to Sharon. That's the dovish side, Barak and Clinton. And that indeed, if you look at the record of the Oslo peace process, that's exactly what it was. It was a careful, calculated effort with U.S. support, because it can't happen otherwise. In fact, payment, so you're paying for it, to establish a permanent neo-colonial dependency. Now, there's a spectrum there, too, just like there is here. So a high official in the Foreign Office, recently important person, now vice president of Tel Aviv University, recently wrote an article on Sharon's strategy, in which he pointed out that the security analysts in the 1970s and the 1980s were looking for a model for the occupied territories. They were looking at South Africa as a model. It's not a big insight, but it's nice to have it said from on high. South Africa, back in the early 1960s, established what they called independent states, black-run states, black leadership, black armies, what are called here Bantustans. And they're at least as viable as the neo-colonial dependency planned by Clinton and Barak for the Palestinians. And that's what the Israeli security establishment was looking at the 70s and the 80s, quite rightly, and then what they began to implement with U.S. help at the Oslo process. Well, here the Camp David proposals, Clinton-Barak proposals were, a lot of gushing about how magnanimous they were and generous and fantastic, and terrible Palestinians wouldn't accept them. There's a very easy way to test that, extremely easy way. Just look at a map. Look at a map which draws the boundaries that were proposed. You can find those maps. They're in the Israeli press. They're in the dissident literature here. They're in the standard scholarly sources. But there's one place where they're missing, the U.S. press. I have not found a single case of a map in the U.S. press, nobody's been able to find, that draws the boundaries. What you can find, and you can find it here too, is maps that give, mention where the settlements are. But then you got to use your imagination. You got to think it through. Say, well, okay, if that's where the settlements are, where are the boundaries? If somebody bothered to draw the boundaries, you'd see exactly how magnanimous the plan was. It broke up the West Bank into 4 separated cantons, virtually separated. There's a salient going east of Jerusalem, including a town called Ma'ale Adumim, which was established basically to bisect the West Bank with a big infrastructure development, roads and stuff linking it to the vastly expanded area of Jerusalem. That bisects the West Bank. There's another salient to the north which bisects it again. That's 3, all separated from a little part of East Jerusalem, which was the center of Palestinian commercial and life and communication. So that's the West Bank, and all separated from Gaza. That's the magnanimous proposal, and it's quite understandable that maps didn't appear, because as soon as you see a map, you know exactly how magnanimous it was. It's kind of impressive that the media and the journals of opinion and so on could be so subordinate to power that nobody broke ranks. I mean, it's not that anyone's telling them, like the government's not ordering them to shut up. and they didn't have to do it if they were ordered. Nobody's telling them. It's just internalized self-censorship. There are some things it just wouldn't do for people to know, like how magnanimous this offer is that we're praising. After having said that, I should say that Clinton and Barack did advance towards a neocolonial dependency. At the time of Camp David in the West Bank, Palestinians were divided into about over 200 tiny little areas, some of them a couple of square kilometers. And Clinton and Barack did make progress. They reduced it to 4 cantons in the West Bank, so they get praise for that. And as I say, understandable that there's no maps and you can interpret the discussion as you like. Under the cover of the Oslo neocolonial process, the U.S. and Israel continued to institute this plan, perfectly clear plan, incorporate the useful part of the territories and, of course, the resources within Israel. Settler population roughly doubled. The worst year was the last year. The last Clinton-Barack year was the highest year of new settlements, highest since before Oslo, and they were planning more in the budget for the following year. Sharon escalated it a bit. After Camp David, here's a sign of hope. In January 2001, there was an informal, meetings went on after Camp David, lots of discussions went on. And in January 2001, a couple of months later, there was a meeting, an informal meeting in Taba of high-level representatives of Israel and the Palestinians, and they actually did move it forward. We have a lot of details about the Taba negotiations from both sides, and it was a better proposal. Maybe it was even the basis for something that might have worked out. It still had the salience, but they were reduced and other possibilities. We don't know where that would have gone. The meetings were called off by Israel, and so we don't know. Then it just goes back to violence. But it was a possibility, and it could be a basis for proceeding. But of course, for it to proceed, there's got to be a organized Palestinian leadership, and the following months that was simply dismantled by violence. The point of the activities of the last year has been to dismantle any functioning Palestinian leadership and undermine that possibility. But of course, it's never forever. We can change it here if we like. The Bush administration carried this long-term rejectionist program forward. Lost track of time. How am I doing on time? Anybody know anything? A couple more. A little more? Okay. Well, the Bush administration pushed all of this forward. Actually, a good indication of it is the fate of the Geneva Conventions. They're very important. The Geneva Conventions were, I'm sure you know, instituted right after the Second World War. They're the core of international humanitarian law. The point was to criminalize formally the actions of the Nazis. The Fourth Convention has to do with what the Nazis did in occupied territories. And the Fourth Convention is what applies to the Israeli occupied territories, what are called here the disputed territories, but they're not disputed. If the Geneva Conventions were applied, just about everything the U.S. and Israel are doing and have done in the occupied territories would be criminal, actually war crimes under U.S. law, and that would be the basis for a settlement of the kind that the world has wanted for a long time. So the Geneva Conventions are quite important. Actually, the U.S. officially recognizes that the conventions apply to the occupied territories. Or to put it differently, it has never withdrawn its official recognition of that. That was, for example, stressed by George Bush #1 30 years ago when he was UN ambassador, and in that role it condemned Israeli violations of the Geneva Conventions in the occupied territories as the occupying power. There were no pretenses then. In 1980, the Security Council unanimously, including the U.S., condemned Israel for what he called flagrant violations of the Geneva Conventions. That included settlement, which the U.S. was funding, so it was a totally hypocritical vote to condemn it because it was funding it, and backing it militarily. That was repeated in 1991, again unanimous. The Bush administration joined. In October 2000, that's the most recent time it came to the Security Council, there was a unanimous endorsement once again of that condemnation of violations of the Geneva Conventions and orders to terminate them. That time Clinton abstained, didn't veto it. I presume he didn't want to veto a core element of international humanitarian law, particularly considering the circumstances under which it was enacted, which in the late 40s. So the U.S. abstained, which is formally means nothing. It means it was unanimously passed, so it is international law, but in practice means it's vetoed. So vetoed from history, you don't read about it. Bush carried it further. Last December, there was a Switzerland, which is the responsible for the Geneva Conventions, called a meeting of the high contracting parties, the signers of the convention who are legally obligated to implement it, to consider once again the application of the conventions to the occupied territories. That meeting, almost everyone attended. All the European Union, even our lieutenant in London showed up. There was they concluded that Israel, meaning the U.S. and Israel, they don't say U.S., was guilty of grave breaches of the conventions. They explained what they were, the settlement policies, which the U.S. funds, willful killings, torture, unlawful deportation, deprivation of the right of fair trial, destruction and appropriation of property, and so on. The U.S., as I said, boycotted it. That kills it, the usual double veto, no reporting, out of history, and a major contribution to what Bush calls enhancing terror when something happens done by people he doesn't like. This was a contribution to it. A week later, the Bush administration made another contribution to enhancing terror. On December 14th, it once again vetoed a Security Council resolution initiated by the Europeans in this case, calling for a dispatch of international monitors to the occupied territories. That's the best way to reduce the level of violence, as everyone knows. Well, the Israeli press, which is pretty reliable on these things, I should say, especially the Hebrew press, they report now that Washington is informing Israeli leaders about plans for radical reconstruction of the whole Middle East. I mean, here it's called democracy, so you read the op-eds in the New York Times and they talk about democracy, but they don't talk about that when they're talking to each other, and no sane person believes it. That's games for intellectuals. What they're telling them is that they want to reconstruct the Middle East region with quite ambitious plans. So, for example, one of the plans that's afoot, how seriously I don't know, is to restore at least part of Iraq to a Hashemite kingdom, which is right under the thumb of the United States, maybe to extend that. It means Jordan. To extend it maybe to parts of Saudi Arabia probably would mean that Turkey takes over the northern parts where much of the oil is, but all under U.S. control, and on to Iran. There are already plans afoot basically to partition Iran. There are plans for Saudi Arabia, and in fact, according to both the Israeli and international press, good sources, they're thinking about going on much farther, as far as China and so on. They feel that they have an enormous preponderance of power, that nobody can stand in their way, and they can do anything they want. And they're basically right, except for reactions here. That's the one place it can be stopped if we want to do it. Well, the Ehud Shprintzak, who's one of the leading Israeli commentators, he just came back from a meeting with Pentagon officials, Rumsfeld and Pearl and those guys, and he informed the press that we are talking about a revolutionary group. One can summarize their approach in one sentence. They think that Arabs are retards who understand only the language of force. Actually, that's an understatement. That's the way they think about the world. You could see that in reaction to what happened in Germany a couple of weeks ago. They're retards too, because they don't understand that you follow American orders and shut up. The Security Council was just informed a couple of days ago by a high administration official. He defined relevance for them. He said the Security Council is relevant if it gives the United States government, Washington, the authorization that Congress gave them. Otherwise, they're irrelevant. They have a choice as to whether to be relevant or not. So the world is a bunch of retards who understand nothing but the language of force, and the guys in Washington understand very well that they have an overwhelming preponderance of it, and they also know very well that the only restriction on it is domestic. Now we're back to ourselves. We're in a free country. We can do a lot of things about that, and nobody else much can. The next step is the invasion of Iraq, probably over the winter. There's a reason for that too. Anybody who's a planner in the Bush administration and is thinking about the next presidential election the war sort of has to be over the winter. That's the best time to carry out a war in that area. So it's either this winter or next winter, but next winter's too late. That's in the middle of the presidential campaign. You don't want people, by the time the presidential campaign comes, you want people to be thinking about the next monster who's going to destroy us and praising the leader who saved us from this awesome threat of destruction, which nobody seems to care about in the region, like Kuwait and Iran. I mean, they're terrified, but they're terrified of the United States, not of Iraq. But somehow we perceive it, and everybody's frightened of this terrible guy, and the cowboy is going to save him. But that has to be over before the next presidential campaign, when we're on to the next. You certainly do not want people to be thinking about what the Bush administration is doing to the country. You don't want to be thinking about the fact that these guys who are recycled Reaganites are doing just what they did in the Reagan administration. They drove the country right away into a deep deficit. Big trick this time, because there was a big surplus. And there's a point to that. I mean, there's a point. They understand. The point is that then you can talk, Alan Greenspan and these guys can talk about the need for fiscal discipline, which means tremendous wealth for the rich through tax cuts and that sort of thing, and crumbs at best for everyone else. You don't want people to be thinking about the consequences of that when the election comes up. There's only one way that's ever been known to prevent it, and that is to frighten people, terrorize them by some monster, whoever it may be, and then praise the powerful leader who saved them from destruction. And that means the timing is kind of urgent. And it's a last resort. Iran's probably next in line. Beyond, there are plenty of choices. As I mentioned, China's being thought of. Syria is very likely. Just a week ago, in one of the leading British journals, a very respected U.S. commentator, senior associate of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Anatol Yevin, expressed an opinion which is very widely held in the world. He ended his comment on all this by saying that under the present administration, the United States is a threat to is a menace to its own people and to the world, and that's quite true. I'll finish and let you talk. It's very commonly said, you hear it all the time, that September 11th changed everything. Nothing's ever going to be the same. I don't think it changed very much. The institutions are pretty stable. Policy flows from institutions. There are variations, like, the Reaganites around Bush are not the same as others. But sometimes the variations are important, but they're within a pretty narrow framework, narrow spectrum. And I think if you take a close look, you see that the guiding principles remain pretty much the same, adapted to circumstances. They can be modified, in fact, radically modified, but that's by organized and active popular forces within the United States. That's where the real hope lies, and I don't think there really is another one. Thanks.
Dr. Chomsky, I'm very curious to hear your take on homeland security. It seems that we have cameras everywhere. When Steven Spielberg did the Minority Report, he talked with a lot of futurists who were talking about the whole retina scan. You know, where can we as Americans go in light of what the government is trying to do and push this one world globalization down our throats?
You're talking about globalization or homeland security?
Well, apparently a little bit of both, because it seems...
Well, they're kind of different things.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, the specific version, what's called globalization, which isn't nothing to do with globalization, is a special form of international economic integration designed in order to benefit investors and lenders and major corporations and so on, with the interests of the world's population, you know, not even secondary, somewhere way behind. And they don't care. They know that the programs retard economic development and growth and so on. That's fine. They do concentrate wealth and power. What you can do about these is stop them. I mean, most of them, and it's not just the United States, of course. It's implemented by a combination of networks of international corporations, the G7, the big 7 rich countries, the U.S. overwhelmingly important among them, the international institutions they have, primarily the IMF, which is kind of an offshoot of the U.S. Treasury. And it's a reason why this is called the Washington Consensus. You know, it comes straight out of Washington. But that's a good thing for us. If it's coming straight out of Washington, it means we can change it. It is very much in our hands. The system of power is very fragile, and they know it. And that's why they continually trying to terrify everybody so you won't pay attention. And there are counterforces. What's called the anti-globalization movement, which is just another term of propaganda. Nobody's against globalization. The global justice movements are looking for a different form of globalization, one that cares about people, not just profits. And that's a powerful movement. You know, there's been nothing like it in history. It's international. It draws from all possible walks of life. It's something completely new, very positive, and you know, plenty of people here directly involved in it. I had a chance to listen to some of them yesterday, and it's impressive. So you can find it right here in Austin and everywhere else. You know, and yeah, they can change globalization to something humane and decent and helpful to people. As far as homeland security is concerned, we have to go back to this very special use of the term terror, technical use, which means terror against us. And it does exist. It's not a joke. It's been known for a long time. It didn't start on September 11th. I mean, so like remember that in 1993, related groups practically blew up the World Trade Center. The conclusion of analysts at the time was that if they had had better planning, they would have blown up the World Trade Center, killing tens of thousands of people. And they had much more ambitious plans. They were going to blow up the UN, the FBI building, the tunnels under the river, and so on. Well, they were caught just in time, but nobody, certainly nobody in intelligence, and in fact no reader of the newspapers, should have had any doubt that it's possible with contemporary technology to carry out major terrorist attacks against the rich and the powerful for the first time. Up until then, it was monopoly of the wealthy and the powerful. Now it's still an enormous preponderance, but it's not a monopoly. There have been technical papers and books in the literature for years about this. They're practically guidebooks to terrorists. So yeah, it's a problem that exists in the whole spectrum of international terrorism. It's small, but that's not to say it's non-existent. I mean, what happened on September 11th was a horrible atrocity. And what almost happened in 1993 would have been a much worse atrocity, except it was just barely stopped. And there'll probably be more. And as I said, there's a way to increase them. The CIA just told us how to increase the threat, namely by invading Iraq. That's a good way to increase the threat. The CIA also told us just a couple of days ago, though again you didn't need them to tell you, that the bombing of Afghanistan had nothing to do with it. That the threat is exactly what it was before that. There have been successes in breaking up these networks, but they're taking places in places like Germany through police work, which is the way to deal with criminal actions, and they've managed to dismantle a number of serious cells. But there's no real concern about that here. All right, getting back to Homeland Security. I mean, I don't object to going, taking my shoes off at the airport, okay? I mean, I think it's a waste of time, but okay. I mean, they've never stopped anything that way, and I doubt if they ever will. But nevertheless, it's okay. I mean, it's not a big problem. On the other hand, when it goes on to what John Ashcroft would really like, kind of proto-fascism, yeah, then it becomes a problem. But we can stop that too. I mean, what's already going on is pretty outrageous. So, for example, in Guantanamo, every principle, known or unknown principle of international humanitarian law is being radically violated. And people are being, I mean, first of all, Guantanamo is even less of a U.S. possession than Texas is. Texas is the result of conquest, and so is, Guantanamo is only the right of, there by the right of conquest. What was called the liberation of Cuba, which was in fact the prevention of Cuba's liberation from Spain, left Cuba as a kind of a U.S. colony until Castro, and they held on to Guantanamo. But sending people there without charge, permanently, no right to counsel. The only crime known is that they were huddling in caves while they were being bombed by, the biggest bombing attack in history. I mean, that is so outrageous you can't even discuss it. It's a violation of everything you can imagine. And the treatment of immigrants here is nothing to cheer about. And vulnerable populations in general are getting it in the neck. And that should not be allowed. It's a big issue here. But nevertheless, you don't have to agree to having it either go on or to be extended to more privileged sectors of the population. But those are choices again. So, if there's some security precautions, okay, I think there should be. But the main way to stop terrorism is to take a look at Crawford and Washington, and certainly not to allow the Ashcroft-style controls to be implemented or go on.
You talked about the importance of activism in affecting change both.
Speak into the mic, please.
Can't hear.
Yes. You talked about the importance of activism in affecting change both domestically and globally. But given your comments on intellectualism, and maybe my definition of intellectualism is different from yours, but what's the impact of the formal educational process in America on affecting change?
Well, I like to quote, so let me quote some liberal sectors of international opinion. After the 1960s saw a lot of ferment and activism and democratic initiatives and public participation and so on. I mean, those are the roots of the feminist movement and the environmental movement and the solidarity movements and things that have really changed the society enormously. And it caused enormous fear and concern among educated sectors. And in fact, there's a major book on it, which you should read if you haven't done so yet, called The Crisis of Democracy, which was published by the Trilateral Commission in 1974, I guess. Trilateral because it's the three centers of industrial democracy, Europe, the United States, and Japan. And it draws from the liberal extreme. I mean, these are, for example, it's the whole Carter administration was drawn from that. Gives you an indication of where they're coming from. Same in Europe and Japan. So this is kind of the liberal internationalist wing of opinion. And they were the crisis of democracy that they were talking about was the fact that there had been an upsurge of democracy in the 1960s. People who are usually apathetic and passive and follow orders the way they're supposed to do, suddenly, through activism, started entering the political arena and pressing their own interests and concerns. Young people, old people, women, men, all what are called the special interests, meaning everybody. But they started trying to do something about their own interests. And that's a crisis of democracy. Like if you study 8th grade civics, they tell you it's democracy. But if you're sophisticated, you know it's a crisis of democracy. It has to be stopped. People have to be returned to apathy and obedience and passivity. And as the American rapporteur said, maybe we can even get back to the good old days when Truman was able to govern the country with the help of a few Wall Street lawyers and financiers. Well, that's kind of an exaggeration, but he kind of captured it, well-known political scientist at Harvard. That's the kind of model. So we have to overcome the crisis of democracy. Or let's get back to the educational institutions. One of the things they were concerned about was the failure of what they called the institutions responsible for the indoctrination of the young. Okay, that includes the schools, the universities, the churches, and so on. They weren't doing their job, the job of indoctrination of the young. They weren't properly training people to be passive, obedient, submissive, paying attention to your own private concerns and letting the smart guys run the world without any trouble. And therefore, these institutions had to do a better job of indoctrinating the young. Okay? That's the liberal wing. The right wing is harsher. And that's been going on for the last 30 years, trying to restore discipline to the institutions. And it hasn't worked. It's been tried. This has gone on in the past. This is not the first such time. This time was unusual in that it hasn't worked. The popular movements have grown and expanded, and the crisis of democracy has gotten greater, and all sorts of means have been used to try to control it. And they've sort of partially worked, but to a large extent they've not. I mean, if you think about it, the major popular movements that have really changed the culture and the society, and they really have, they've raised the level of civilization significantly. Those are products of the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. I mentioned a couple. Feminist movement, the 70s. Environmental movement began then. The anti-nuclear movements, the solidarity movements, the global justice movements that I mentioned are recent. You know, I mean, actually they're old, but in the third world they've been going on for decades. But the West began to join them in the last couple of years, and that's important. And you know, it's been hard to repress. And well, as I say, I was over and talking to people in East Austin yesterday and saw some impressive ways in which it's not only not repressed, but it's expanding. It's hard to control people, and the institutions, the indoctrination institutions themselves have changed. I don't like what goes on in the media and the universities, but it's a lot better than it was 30 or 40 years ago. I mean, in all sorts of ways. Well, let me just give you one personal example, but it's illustrative of changes. I happen to live in a professional, upper middle class suburb of Boston. Educated people, very progressive, vote the right way on everything and so on. I mean, unless it's on letting blacks into Lexington, then that doesn't work. But I had a daughter who was in 4th grade back in 1969 in a, it's called a good progressive type school. I was looking through her textbook one day, and she had a textbook on colonial New England. And it was sort of description of, the structure is there's a boy, his name is Robert, he's being told about the wonders of colonial New England by an older man. I was wondering how they're going to handle the big massacres, like the Pequot massacre, the first big massacre in New England when the colonists waited until the merciless Indian savages left the village, and then they went in and murdered all the women and children and old people. So how are they going to handle it? Well, it turned out they told the story accurately. They described it just the way I did, but with praise. In fact, the boy who's being told all this says, I wish I were a man and had been there, so like I could have done it too. It happens that this was right after the My Lai massacre had been exposed. I showed it to my wife, and, outraged, of course, went in and talked to the teacher. Asked, showed the teacher the passage. Teacher didn't understand what the problem was. Didn't seem to be any words misspelled. I mean, and then she sort of, asked her, is this the kind of thing you ought to be teaching children ever? I mean, certainly right with the My Lai massacre on the front pages. Well, the answer was, look, not everybody's liberal the way you are. We have to reflect. Now, that I am sure there's not a part of the country anywhere where you could have a textbook like that now. It's inconceivable, you know. But then it was normal. That's the way, you know, that's the way you treat the niggers. And that's a change. And it's a change all over the culture, you know, which has a big effect. And we should remember that. We're told everything's died. It's totally wrong. It's the best time I can ever remember for organizing and activism. And that's why there are such massive efforts to terrify people, because power is fragile, you know, and it can easily break down. It's not going to take much. So the indoctrination institutions have changed. They're a lot better than they were.
It was pointed out to me by someone in the audience that there's perhaps a gender pattern in how people got to the mic, which, I mean, I knew there were gender patterns before, okay, but I do want to tell the ushers at the microphone that if some of the women didn't get a chance to get up in line, and we are probably not going to get to everybody in line, with at least it seems the assent of some of the audience, it's okay if some of the women move up in line to make sure they can get. Okay. And on to the next question. Okay. Over on this side. Go ahead.
Could you address the so-called war on drugs?
Well, the war on drugs is another case of trying to terrorize the population. I mean, drugs are whatever problem they are, you know, the war on drugs has nothing to do with whatever the drug problem is. I mean, everybody knows how you deal with substance abuse problems. There's one method that works, and to the credit of Richard Nixon, he actually implemented it, and it worked. The method that works is prevention and treatment, okay? Education, prevention, and treatment. That's overwhelmingly effective. I mean, there's a famous study by the Rand Corporation and the U.S. Army done a couple of years ago in which they just pure cost effectiveness tried to estimate the effectiveness by, you know, the cost of reaching a certain level of success in different ways of dealing with drugs. So the one that was by far the cheapest and most effective was prevention and treatment. About 7 times more expensive was police work. About, you know, I don't know, 10 times less effective was border interdiction. And about, you know, maybe 20 times less effective was what they call out-of-country activity, which I saw some of in Southern Colombia a couple of months ago. What that is chemical warfare carried out by mercenaries, most of them what are called private corporations like DynCorp. Probably there are guys around here who do it, ex-military men who work under U.S. government contract to privatize terror. Terror is often privatized. That's why their paramilitary terror is always so awful. It's privatization of terror for, you know, plausible deniability, it's called. And now they're privatizing U.S. terror too. So instead of the U.S. Air Force doing it, so-called private corporations do it, which are offshoots of the military, personnel, payment, and so on. Well, what they're doing is just driving peasants off the land. You know, and this is understandable. You know, you want to drive the peasants off the land, destroy peasant agriculture. It's a very fragile tradition. It goes back thousands of years, but it's pretty fragile. It's just handed on from, it's very delicate, very productive, very effective. Usually handed through women, you know, like a mother teaches her daughter, and so nobody knows about it. But it has very high productive levels, very closely related to the biodiversity, and in Colombia, where I was, there's very high biodiversity. So the idea is to destroy it. You know, you drive the peasants off the land, you eliminate the biodiversity, big corporations come in, start strip mining the mountains and sending coal to pollute people here. You can put up hydroelectric plants for, you know, multinational industry. Monsanto can come in and sell them genetically modified seeds for unicrop agro-export, and the people just join the several million people who are displaced or flee or dead or something. That's called the war on drugs. I mean, the whole thing would be totally outrageous, even if it were concerned with drugs. I mean, like, we don't think that, say, China has a right to bomb North Carolina, say, where they produce substances that are far more lethal than anything produced in Colombia.
Oh,
but that's just not. Just to be clear about it, it's not what's farmed that's lethal. Like, there's nothing wrong with, maybe opium and tobacco aren't good for you, but they're not harmful. It's the industrialized product that's harmful, and that's been true for centuries. But it's just outrageous. You don't do that sort of thing. And besides, it has nothing to do with reducing drugs. And it's way more expensive than the methods that do work. So that's the war on drugs. It has a double purpose. It does have a purpose, I mean, like most things. Its purpose is, first of all, to terrify the American population by making them think that, the children are going to be murdered by Colombian narco-traffickers or something, so therefore we need a powerful state and homeland security and big army and that sort of thing. And also it gets rid of what's called in the criminology literature the dangerous classes. You take a look at the history of Prohibition all the way back, centuries. So you almost always targets people who are considered a problem domestically because they're poor or they're, immigrants or something or other. So like, take, say, marijuana. Why was marijuana picked as the drug of choice to criminalize? Well, first of all, they needed something after Prohibition ended. You got this big federal bureaucracy, and they can't go after prohibitions. They needed something. But why marijuana? Well, marijuana was used by Mexicans and by blacks. Okay, so therefore, let's go after marijuana. They didn't have any medical evidence. In fact, they still don't have any medical evidence. But yeah, that's what you go after. Actually, if you take a look at marijuana use, I mean, it peaked in the late 70s, but criminalization was very low because the people who are using it are folks like you, and you don't go after those people. I mean, you go after those people, the cops end up in jail, not the people. But if you pick a black kid in the streets of some downtown slum who has a joint in his pocket, that's an easy collar and nobody's going to make a fuss, and you throw him into jail and you control the dangerous classes. That's how you get the incarceration rate to go out of sight and remove a couple of million people from the streets who you don't have anything to do with in the neoliberal economy. I mean, in places like Colombia, you murder them. You send out the death squads, but we're civilized, so you send them into jail. But so it controls the dangerous classes and it terrifies everyone else. And that's an achievement. But as to having to do with drugs, nothing to do with it. Certainly, you don't have to read the Rand Corporation report to know this. Just take a look at the statistics of substance use over the years. As I said, marijuana was peaked around the late 70s. Through the 1980s, there has been a steady decline among more educated sectors in the use of everything. Hard drugs, soft drugs, alcohol, tobacco, red meat, you name it, it's all been declining. It's not because of any criminalization. It's because of education and, choices of a different lifestyle. And yeah, that's the way things change. It didn't happen among poorer people. So if you hang around a university, you're not likely to see people smoking. You go to the local McDonald's and look at teenage kids from the poor areas, yeah, they may well have cigarettes. That's a class issue, and that's why you call it a drug war, because then it can be a class war, basically. And class in the United States means largely race, so rich.
I believe many of us are here today because we find that we're on the precipice of a very dangerous moment in the history of the United States and potentially in the world. And you have said that people here and other people like us all over this country are the hope. But I didn't feel you indicated clearly enough what we should be for. You've said what we should be against. nor have you said how. You didn't mention, for example, voting in the next 3 weeks or so, something that could be important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there are lots and lots of ways. I mean, like I said, I was over in East Austin yesterday, and I heard people talking about lots of things they're doing, which are fine ways to do it. Voting is okay if there's a choice. You know, if there's no choice, it doesn't matter much. And let me add that the fact of the matter is that no matter who is in office, they are going to have to respond to organized and active public opinion, no matter who they are. So, you know, take, say, the Reagan administration, which is the same guys as now, you know, mostly the same people. I mean, they came into office with very ambitious plans. They were going to invade Central America. They were going to have a huge increase in nuclear weapons, you know, all kind of stuff. They backed off. They didn't back off because they got a religious conversion. They backed off because there was an uprising in the country. They couldn't invade Central America like Kennedy had done 20 years earlier in Vietnam. They had to resort to what's called clandestine warfare, meaning everybody in the world knows about it except the American population, which is bad enough, you know, but it's not B-52s. They instantly created a huge anti-nuclear movement. You know, it's like 75% of the population was demanding reduction in nuclear weapons. It's not pretty what they did, but they had to back off of that. And they even had to back off on the fiscal measures. You know, they allowed somewhat to overcome the initial tax cuts. These are the same guys. They're as reactionary as you can get, but they cannot ignore public pressure. It doesn't matter who it is. I think that's, you know, you can make your own judgments, but by and large, that usually turns out to be more effective than voting. I mean, it is important if there's a choice to get better people in, undoubtedly, but it's the general level of activism that's causing the overwhelming effect. What should we be in favor of? Well, you know, I think there are a lot of things we can just agree on, like we should be in favor of more democracy. What does more democracy mean? Well, first of all, more democracy means undermining the current globalization programs because they are aimed primarily at reducing democracy. Take, say, financial liberalization. People don't talk about it this way, but just think about it. Financial liberalization, which was the core of the new programs, and has had a harmful economic effect, but its main effect is to reduce democracy. And it's understood. You know, if you allow free, there's a reason why after the Second World War, the international economic system that was designed by Keynes and White, Britain and the United States, included capital controls, crucially, and included and regulated currencies within a narrow band. That allows space for governments to carry out what we call welfare state programs, usually called social democratic programs, for the benefit of the general population. It allows them some space to do that without being cut off at the pass. If you have free capital flow, that creates what's called a virtual Senate of investors and lenders that carry out I'm quoting from technical papers now, a moment-by-moment referendum on government policies. And if they think the government policies are, you know, kind of irrational, like they're helping people instead of increasing profits, they just destroy the currency. They attack the currency and they pull the capital out of the country and it all goes down the tube. And we're seeing that right now in Brazil. You know, and it's standard. If any country tries to get out of line, you know, the constituency of investors and lenders stop them. And that's a large part of the point of financial liberalization. Or take what's going on in secret in Geneva right now, the negotiations over the GATS, the General Agreement on Trade and Services. It's in secret because people don't want you to know about it. The activist movements know all about it, and they've been protesting about it for years, but it's not in the front pages. What they're calling for is privatization of services. What does that mean? What are services? Well, services is anything that anybody might care about, you know, like education or pensions or welfare or security or, you know, water, anything that people might want to have some say in. What you have to do is privatize those things. What is privatized? There's no economic argument for privatization, but there is a political argument. privatization undermines democracy. It removes the choices out of the public arena into the hands of totalitarian institutions. And remember, a corporation is a totalitarian institution. It's about as close as people have come to that in history. It's not a joke. Just think about it. It's a command economy, controlled from the top, very little public accountability, no participation except through the hierarchy. Yes, we call totalitarianism in the political domain. If you can transfer the public arena into the hands of unaccountable private tyrannies, you can have formal democracy and it won't matter because there's nothing to decide, you know, except what color to paint the street signs or something. So that's fine. And those are major attacks on democracy, and we ought to be stopping them. Stopping them, if we go on, means dismantling the totalitarian institutions. There's no reason for them to exist. They exist, and now we're going on, you know. In fact, we're going on to what was second nature to American working people in the 19th century. You know, we'll be recovering understanding which was commonplace among working people all over the United States in the 19th century. In fact, it was even a slogan of the Republican Party. The slogan of the Republican Party was that there's no big difference between wage labor and slavery. And we've sort of had that beaten out of our heads. But people understood it then, and it was significant. That's what they fought the Civil War about. And it was also understood, I'm just quoting from the labor press, that those who work in the mills ought to own them and run them. And democracy ought to be expanded throughout the system. Okay, now we're talking about serious stuff. So there are a lot of things to be for, and they're not even innovations. They come right out of the, you know, homespun American tradition. Yeah, we ought to be working for those things, I think. The Russians were intervening to control their Eastern European domains. And, you know, by our standards, they had a lot of justification. I mean, I don't think there was any justification, but if you accept U.S. doctrine, they had every justification. Actually, that's the invasion route through which they had practically been destroyed 3 times in the 20th century. So the fact that they wanted to control it is not all that crazy. That's it, though. The rest of the world was U.S. intervention. And there were limits on it. The limit on it was that, you know, that we were deterred. In fact, there's an example of that, which we just learned about, more about a couple of weeks ago. Very important. As I'm sure you know, this is the 40th anniversary of the missile crisis, right? The missile crisis, Arthur Schlesinger, one of Kennedy's advisors, just described it as the most dangerous moment in history. That's not an exaggeration. It was maybe the most dangerous moment in history. The U.S. was, at that time, carrying out terrorist attacks against Cuba, serious terrorist attacks, following Kennedy's order to unleash the terrors of the earth against Cuba because of its very existence, he said, was a successful defiance of U.S. policy of a century and a half of subordinating the Caribbean to U.S. rule, and it might inspire others to do the same. So he had to unleash the terrors of the earth. They were going on, serious terrorist operations. The Cubans and the Russians took it to be a preliminary to another invasion. And while the U.S. now claims there weren't any invasion plans, McNamara himself, Secretary of Defense, said if he'd been in their shoes, he'd had to interpret it that way too. The Russians sent missiles to Cuba for deterrence, right? They wanted to deter an American invasion. It was a mad act, you know, practically destroyed the world. Fortunately, it didn't, but it came awfully close. But that was deterrence. It sort of half worked. Kennedy made a weak statement with a lot of qualifications that they wouldn't invade Cuba, but they never withdrew the plans. And the terrorist operations continued, in fact. Up until 10 days before the assassination, Kennedy's assassination, he was initiating new and more extreme plans for terrorism in Cuba. But it was a case of successful deterrence. The U.S. never invaded Cuba. There were plans. I mean, in early 1962, we've just learned, the Joint Chiefs and the Defense Department approved a plan to concoct a pretext which would enable the U.S. to invade Cuba. Okay, so it wasn't a joke. but deterrence worked. That's probably the most successful example of containment in the post-war period. But it's not discussed in the literature on containment for reasons that you can figure out. So yeah, there was containment and there was deterrence. Both ways, mostly blocking the more aggressive and violent power. It doesn't make any sense to ask, is the war on terror a continuation of this? I mean, it's got nothing to do with it. What's happened is that the West, it's been understood for years that the rich industrial powers have lost their monopoly of terror. I mean, they still have an overwhelming preponderance, but they don't have a monopoly. And now there are terrorist groups around the world which are breaking that monopoly, and pretty seriously. Like what I described in 1993 wasn't a joke, and what actually happened in September 11th, though not as bad as what it looked like in 93, was bad enough. And there's going to be more. And as I said, there are ways to increase it. But there's no such thing as containment. There's nothing to do with it. You want to stop the terror, you listen to the experts who I was quoting. They all understand how to stop it. You reduce the grievances. I mean, let's take a smaller case. Take, say, IRA terror in London. I mean, one way to react to it would have been, say, to send the RAF to bomb Boston. Okay, I mean, that was the center of the financing. Okay, you know, so why not bomb Boston? And while you're at it, flatten West Belfast, you know, because that's where they're coming from. Well, you know, I mean, apart from feasibility, that would have been total insanity. I mean, the British tried to repress it by force, just got worse. They finally got into their heads they better pay some attention to the grievances, which are a lot of them legitimate. It's not to say that the bomb in London was legitimate. It's not. It's a criminal act. You deal with it like a criminal act. But it comes out of real grievances, like the kinds that I was quoting. You don't deal with the grievances, you're going to have more. You know? So yeah, you want to stop terror, there are ways.
This Tuesday night, UT student government will be voting on a resolution denouncing the war in Iraq, of which I believe you received a copy. What can and should students do to be as successful as those in the 1960s in building popular support against this completely unnecessary war in Iraq?
So I think you're now already way more successful than anything in the 60s, far more successful. Remember how much we've progressed since the 60s. I mean, Kennedy announced publicly that the U.S. was bombing South Vietnam in 1962. That's 40 years. There was no protest, no students, nobody else. It was years before protest movements began to develop. I mean, in like Boston, where I live, kind of liberal city, we couldn't have a public demonstration against the war until late 1966, 4 years later, because it would be broken up violently, mostly by students. Okay? By that time, there were hundreds of thousands of American troops rampaging around. The country had been practically wiped out. Now we're way more advanced, and big protests are going on before the war starts. So you've already accomplished a lot more than was accomplished in the 60s, and you should recognize that. And got to go on from there. I mean, if the U.S. wins a cheap victory, if these right-wing guys win a cheap victory in Iraq, the world is in deep trouble, because that's just going to embolden them to go on to bigger things, and they've already told us what those bigger things are, if you want to pay attention. So first of all, you know, main priority is just don't let them get away with it, but next is to make sure there's a very heavy cost, and the cost is going to be here. You know? So it's understood that you can't get away with this kind of stuff. And there's no magic tricks for doing that, you know, any more than there were in the late 60s when it finally got going. You know, you do it by educational activities, organizing, demonstrations, resistance, I mean, whatever the circumstances allow. You know, it has to be fitted to the circumstances. Some things make sense at some times and not at other times, and that you got to judge. You have to ask where you are, what people think, you know, so on. I mean, right now, I think the main thing to do is to try to break through the utterly irrational hysteria about Saddam being Hitler who's going to conquer the world. I mean, that's insane. You know, that's why nobody in the region is concerned about it. They're concerned, but about the United States. They're not concerned about, I mean, he's a monster, undoubtedly, just as he was when George Bush #1 was happily providing him with means to develop weapons of mass destruction, which incidentally went on up to the day of the invasion of Kuwait, after all his worst crimes were over. So yeah, I'm still a monster, but fortunately a much weaker one. And we can make it worse by doing just what the CIA said, you know, attacking. Yeah, I think the main thing is to break through this hysterical terror, like the fear of the war on drugs and everything else. And that just takes patient educational campaigns and organizational activity. You've got to get to people. You've got to get to them where they are, not where you are. And that takes time and effort. But it can be done. It's a pretty thin cover. And as Rahul said before, there's no argument that's been offered that a 5-year-old couldn't answer. So, okay, do it. You know.
Dr. Chomsky, you have spoken on several instances today about what you believe are the underlying, or what you perceive as the underlying causes of terrorism in the world, you know, mainly that being in third world countries and such. I would like to know what you think about I can take this into consideration. Cultural and political deficiencies exist in many countries in the world, and much of this goes back hundreds of years. How much of
cultural and political deficiencies?
Deficiencies, yes.
Yeah.
How much of a role do you think this plays into creating terrorism?
Well, there certainly are cultural and political deficiencies. In fact, I mentioned some. So when my daughter in 4th grade in a progressive town was taught that genocide is great fun, that's a cultural and political deficiency. And it extended, you know, it wasn't just in 4th grade. I mean, you read the main diplomatic history that was published around 1970, U.S. diplomatic history, by a well-known liberal scholar. He says, after the revolution, I'm virtually quoting now, he says, after the revolution, the colonists turned to their next task, which was, I'm quoting it now, felling trees and Indians and expanding to their natural borders, you know, like the Mexican border. Yeah, that's a really serious cultural deficiency, and and there's a way of overcoming it. The way of overcoming it is all the work that's been done in the last 40 years to overcome it, and it to some extent has been overcome. So yeah, there certainly are cultural and political deficiencies. Political deficiencies have to do with the concentration of power, and that's not just political, but also economic and ideological power in centers that try to extend this terror. That's serious. And it goes on right to the present. Like what I was talking about in Colombia, I just saw a couple of months ago. In Turkey, some of the worst terror of the 1990s was taking place thanks to the fact that the U.S. was providing 80% of the arms. You know, yeah. So there's plenty of cultural deficiencies to worry about. They're right close to home. There are plenty of cultural deficiencies elsewhere too. But we can do a lot about the ones here. Actually, we do about the ones that are there. So like take, say, the Middle East, okay? That's what I assume was in the back of your mind. Yeah, plenty of cultural and political deficiencies. And there are some reasons for that too. And what's more, the U.S. government knows the reasons. And we would know the reasons too if we had educational institutions and a press and so on, which told us what's right on the surface. So I'll just give you one example. George Bush recalled his plaintive question, why do they hate us after September 11th? Well, he may not know, but if he'd paid some attention at Yale, he would have known the answer. And we know. I mean, you can read them right in the highest level internal U.S. documents. Okay, so in 1958, the same year I didn't mention this, one of the things that Eisenhower was worried about was what he called, this is internal discussion, the campaign of hatred against us in the Arab world, not by the governments, the facade, but by the people, okay? And the National Security Council, the highest planning agency, discussed it, and they attributed it to the fact that people in the Arab world recognize that the United States is supporting corrupt and brutal regimes and blocking democracy and development, and we're doing it because we want to control Near East oil. And furthermore, they recommended that we continue. So yeah, there are cultural and political deficiencies, and they don't come out of the genes. I mean, I'm not suggesting that that was the only source, but it's a crucial source. And it's particularly crucial for us because it's the one we can control. You know, you can't do much about whatever happened in the 18th century, but you can do a lot about what the U.S. is doing right now. And there are plenty of cultural and political deficiencies right close to home that we can do a lot about.
Dr. Chomsky, my question is regarding the infamous Axis of Evil speech by George Bush Jr. I wanted to ask, what's your view on that speech and labeling countries, you know, just as axis of evil and mounting up campaigns against them, and specifically applying to Iran as a country which is, well, I mean, kind of blatantly not supposed to be in there, because Karen Hughes was in here about 4 days ago saying that, along the lines of, that they are one of the countries that don't espouse our values, and they don't allow the education of women. Now,
actually, they do allow the education. Yeah, go ahead.
But the thing was, after the fall of the Shah, it's arguable that the actual education rate's been doubled ever since, you know, after the Khomeini, etc. So, what's your view on it?
Well, first of all, just on the phrase "axis of evil," it's not. This isn't the only country where it's used. So, for example, the Egyptian press has also used the phrase "axis of evil," referring to the United States, Turkey, and Israel. Okay, and that's a much more sensible usage. I mean, there's plenty of evil to go around, and they are an actual axis. I mean, there's no axis between Iraq and Iran, which, you know, have been practically destroying each other, and North Korea was tossed in just so that there'd be somebody who wasn't an Arab, you know, or not an Arab. You remember, in the United States, Iranians are Arabs. You have to remember that. So just like, you know, the Afghans were recalcitrant Arabs. Arab's a very generic term. So you had to throw in somebody to make it look like it wasn't a war against Islam. The word axis was chosen by Bush's speechwriters. He probably doesn't know what it means because of the, you know, because of the connotations. So the axis was Hitler and, you know, Italy, Mussolini, and that kind of thing. So that's why it's an axis of evil. But but the Egyptian version is in fact accurate. As far as Iran is concerned, well, you know, I mean, you know the history, I'm sure. So in '53, there was a conservative nationalist government in 1953 which tried to take control of their own resources. That was overcome by a U.S.-British military coup, restored the Shah. The liberal press here, speaking about cultural deficiencies, take a look back at the New York Times at the time. Everybody knew what happened, and they praised it because they said it's an object lesson to countries that go berserk with hysterical nationalism. Okay? That's a real cultural deficiency. To talk about giving an object lesson to people who go berserk with hysterical nationalism by trying to take some control of their own resources under a conservative nationalist regime. Okay, then comes the Shah. You know, quarter century of torture and terror and violence and so on, one of the worst human rights records in the world. Not a word about, nothing about it here. Actually, there's a good study by two good journalism professors, Farhang and Dorman, you know that book, the book on the media in Iran, which is very dramatic. I mean, they just go through media coverage of human rights violations in Iran. Up until the fall of the Shah, you know, everything was nice. After the fall of the Shah, all of a sudden, there come to be big human rights violations. Yeah, because it was the other guys who were doing it. Carter, Nobel Prize winner, went to Iran, I think it was January '78 or something, and praised the Shah for, you know, he said he was so impressed by the love his people showed for him and so on and so forth. Okay, a couple of months later, an unanticipated popular rebellion overthrew the Shah. Okay, well, what did the U.S. do? The first thing that Carter did was to send a NATO general, General Heuser, to Iran to try to instigate a military coup. I mean, that's the first reaction when a country gets out of control. You turn to the military. And they tried, but it didn't work. You know, the military wasn't ready to overthrow the new government. Immediately began something which is later called the Iran Contra hostage business, which has nothing to do with hostages. There weren't any. Right away, the Carter administration started sending arms to Iran via Israel, which had very close relations with the Iranian military, funded by Saudi Arabia. Okay, now we're back to the axis of evil again. And the idea was, it was said very plainly, I mean, it's public, you know, the sort of more or less unofficial Israeli ambassador to Iran, Uri Lubrani, the way he put it over British television was that we wanted to find military officers who would be willing to shoot down 10,000 people in the streets, and if they did, we could restore the good old days under the Shah. Well, you know, that's right, and that's standard operating procedure. That's what happened in Indonesia. It's what happened in Chile, and those are the models that they had in mind. You want to overthrow a civilian government, you arm the military. You know, the colonels and those guys who are going to carry out a military coup. Standard procedure. The Iranians figured it out. They caught the people involved and they executed them at around 1964. And then comes another phase, the Oliver North phase, with you know, Robert McFarlane going through the streets of Tehran, waving Bibles and that kind of stuff. And it was by then tied into the U.S. war in Nicaragua. And now that's called arms for hostages deal, but can't be that. I mean, there were no hostages in the early 80s. And in fact, the first hostages happened to be Iranian in Lebanon. But that was a nice cover for it. But in fact, it's just the standard way of trying to overthrow a government. It didn't work. Meanwhile, Iran went on its own way. I mean, if U.S. corporations would want to get back into Iran, you know, they don't want to be edged out by their European rivals. And they're in favor of building pipelines through Iran, which is the easiest way to do it. But the U.S. government won't allow it. I mean, there are reformist movements in Iran which would be happy to link up to the United States, but the government here won't allow it. And in fact, they're even overruling, apparently, their own energy corporations, which is kind of unusual. And there's a reason, I think there's a reason for that. This is a country, it's kind of like what I said about Cuba. You cannot allow people to get away with successful defiance of the United States. The enforcer doesn't allow that. And people have to understand that successful defiance is going to lead to punishment. Cuba is a rather similar example. And there have been 40 years of terror and economic strangulation, which even the U.S. business community isn't in favor of. But it goes on because of successful defiance, as the Kennedy guys put it, which cannot be tolerated. You want to run the world, people have to understand that you follow orders. That's why they bombed Serbia. You take a look at the actual reasons given, actual reasons, both at the time and in retrospect. The only one that made any sense that they keep to is what they call the credibility, keeping the credibility of NATO. Okay, that's Tony Blair and Bill Clinton and everyone else. When they talk about the credibility of NATO, they are not talking about Belgium and Italy, right? They're talking about the credibility of the United States and its attack dog, Britain. Their credibility is what's important. And credibility means you're scared out of your wits and you know you don't cross the master. It's you want to figure it out, ask, you know, the neighborhood mafia don. I mean, if somebody doesn't pay protection money, the don does not go and get a court order to get the money, you know, right? I mean, even if he could get the court order. And the same reason the U.S. doesn't go to the Security Council to get authorization. If you're the don, you teach the guy a lesson so that others understand that you don't get out of line. And that need for credibility, as it's called that in the international relations literature, maintaining credibility. That often overrides even economic motivations. And I suspect, you know, we don't have documents, but it's speculative, but I suspect that that's primarily what's going on with regard to Iran. They have to be taught a lesson, and everybody else does too. And the lesson is, you don't disobey the don.
In the latest Texas Observer, Jamie
Can
Galbraith
you
has
speak closer into the mic, please?
Jamie Galbraith has an article in the latest Texas Observer
And I'd like to read 2 sentences from it and ask you to comment on it. He says, first, that the rules of a fair game must be independent of the identity of the players.
Of the
Identity of the players, which is something I basically agree with. But then he goes on to say, a year ago, I urged my friends to support our action of justified self-defense in Afghanistan. I believe then and do now that what we did there was not flawless, but it was right. And
well,
I kind of think...
let's take his... I think his principle's right, too.
Right.
Fair game means fair for everybody. Okay, so is he calling for Cuba and Nicaragua and Haiti and a whole bunch of other people to bomb Washington? Why not? Why not? You know, I mean, if it's fair for us to bomb Afghanistan because we think, you know, the U.S. thinks, doesn't know, that maybe there's somebody there who was involved in terrorism against the United States. And notice they don't know. They didn't know at the time. I mean, even a couple of months ago, Robert Mueller, the head of the FBI, testified before the Senate, that's 8 months after the bombing, that we now believe that the plot was hatched in Afghanistan, but implemented and financed in Germany and United Arab Republics. Okay, so if without knowing it's just for us to bomb Afghanistan, then after 40 years of terror, why isn't it just for Cuba to bomb Washington? And why isn't it just for Nicaragua to bomb Washington and New York after the U.S. not only carried out a major terrorist war against them, but was even ordered by the World Court to terminate its international terrorism and then went on to escalate it? Now we can go on and on. I mean, if extradition is an issue, you know, the U.S. didn't ask Afghanistan to extradite Osama bin Laden. I mean, the Taliban made some moves in that direction, but the U.S. just rebuffed it. They didn't want to hear about it because the Don doesn't play games with laws. They told the Afghans, just turn them over because we say so, and we're not going to provide you with any evidence. Okay, right at that same moment, you know, like happens to be September 30th, 2001, Haiti renewed, not for the first time, renewed its request to the U.S. government for extradition through official channels of a nice guy named Emmanuel Constant, who was the head of the paramilitary forces that killed about 4,000 or 5,000 Haitians very brutally in the early 90s with the support of George Bush #1 and Bill Clinton. There's no question of his guilt. In fact, he was sentenced in absentia. He doesn't deny it, nor does the U.S. government. Did the U.S. extradite him? They didn't even answer. They didn't even respond. Okay, so he was responsible for killing 4,000 or 5,000 black people. You know, it's the way you deal with the niggers, remember? So they didn't respond to the request. The press didn't bother mentioning it, you know, who cares? So is Haiti entitled to, does Galbraith think that Haiti is entitled to set off terrorist bombs all over the United States? I mean, if the rules of the game are supposed to be fair, why not? In fact, if you look at all the literature, there's a ton of literature just like this. It's unfair to pick him out. There's a ton of literature on how bombing Afghanistan was a just war in self-defense. Okay, simply apply to that literature, all of it, 100%, the test of fair game, and see if there is anything in it that begins to meet that minimal condition. Try it. I think you'll find that nothing does, and it's all a pile of junk and pure hypocrisy, and nobody can possibly believe a word they're saying.
I'm wondering if Bush and his pro-war faction are successful in launching the attack on Iraq, whether we might not be falling into some plot or strategy laid by Osama bin Laden.
He'll be delighted. Yeah, he'll be delighted. I mean, if he's alive or whoever his associates are, they would love nothing better. I mean, it's a gift to them for the United States to attack Iraq for exactly the reasons the CIA just pointed out. I mean, attacking Iraq is going to, you know, it'll probably inspire Iraqi. For all we know, Iraq already has, you know, loose nukes sitting somewhere in a hotel in New York, ready to blow them up. Maybe, you know, but that's the kind of action that would lead them to respond. Furthermore, it really will inspire an even greater campaign of hatred against the United States and not only in the Arab world, but all over much of the world. It's already happening. And there's nothing that Osama bin Laden types would like better than that. So if he were planning it, he couldn't do a better job. You know? And they understand that perfectly well in Washington, but it's not important. You know, they don't care. Just like they understood in 1958, what I read, the Eisenhower administration. These are kind of mainstream conservative Republicans, not maniacs like these guys. They understood that they were inspiring what they called a campaign of hatred against us, but they advised that we should continue. Of course, it's more important to block democracy and development and impose corrupt and oppressive governments because that's the way we control Near East oil. So if there's a campaign of hatred, okay, repress it by force. So yes, I agree with you. I think it's Osama bin Laden or somebody like him would love it, pleading for it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
About how many U.S. government employees would you estimate we have running around that are assassinating people who disagree with current policies?
In the United States?
In the United States, U.S. government employees.
I think none. That's not the way it works here. I mean, there are such cases, and they're real. So for example, take COINTELPRO, something we know about, because the documents came out under court order. It was a very, if you don't know about it, you should. It's the most serious attack on civil liberties in the United States in its history. This was a campaign that went on through 4 administrations, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, our friend, and Nixon. Was finally exposed during the Nixon years, not in the press or anything like that. It was exposed by courts and lawyers, and it was a major campaign to try to undermine any kind of political dissent in the United States. It started with the Communist Party and then went to the American Indian movement and the Puerto Rican movement and the black movements and the New Left and the women's movement. It finally was everybody. And that did get us, that was pretty serious. That went as far as political assassination. It did. It's the one case we know of that went to political assassination. But that was a black organizer. That was Fred Hampton, a black organizer in Chicago who was set up by the FBI and assassinated by the Chicago police in a setup, in a Gestapo-style assassination. You break into the apartment at 4 o'clock in the morning and murder him, and some Mark Clark in bed, maybe drugged. All a FBI setup. Okay, that's real, but that's a black organizer. Okay, that's bombing the niggers again, so it's not a big deal. It was never considered an issue during the Watergate hearings, for instance. Watergate was about trivialities, real trivialities. But things like assassinating a black organizer, that wasn't a crime, because it isn't a crime. That's just normal operating procedure. And if you open the doors on that, you don't go after Nixon, you go after everybody, because it goes way back. But it was real, but it's unusual. It's not the way this country works. So I don't think there are, the least, there are plenty of places in the world where you have to worry about assassination. It's like you're in Colombia, like my counterparts in Colombia where I just was. Yeah, they have to worry about assassination, but we don't have to worry about it.
And my question is, what are the basic forces and patterns in a culture, and beneath that, in fundamental human nature that drive empire-building behavior?
I don't think there's anything special in human nature. Take a look at human history. There are thousands of years where people, tend their farms and don't try to murder each other and so on and so forth. Human nature allows all sorts of things. Under specific circumstances and conditions and institutional structures, yeah, you're going to get aggressive and violent behavior. Not just here, but many other places, but the answer to that is not in human nature. It's in getting rid of those circumstances and institutions. So other aspects of human nature can flourish, as has happened throughout history. Look, and right now, the population now is much more opposed to aggression and violence than it was 40 years ago, much more. I gave some examples, and there's a lot more. And it's the same genes. It's just different level. You know, a lot of cultural defects have been overcome, and there's plenty more to go. You know, what's driving it? Well, you know, it's not always the same thing. You know, like the Roman Empire wasn't driven by the same goals as you know, Richard Pearl and Paul Wolfowitz. But if you check back, you can find the reasons. It's not very profound. You know, I mean, the U.S. It takes the United States. I mean, the U.S. was never intended to be a democracy. I mean, Madison didn't have a democracy in mind. You read the Constitutional Convention and the debates. He wanted the U.S. to be what political scientists now call a polyarchy, not a democracy. That is a country where, in Madison's words, power is in the hands of the wealth of the nation, men who are sympathetic to the rights of property owners. And you want to keep the public marginalized and fragmented so they don't get in the way. And he had good reasons for it. He's a smart guy. And the country was set up that way. I mean, Madison of course, used the example of England as a model. So in the debates in the Constitutional Convention, he tried to bring out to people how dangerous democracy would be. He said, suppose in England people actually had the right to make decisions, you know, through the electoral system. The first thing they would do is dispossess property owners. That is, they'd carry out what we nowadays call agrarian reform. And we can't allow that. That's an atrocity. So therefore, you have to make sure that power is in the hands of the wealth of the nation, people who understand what he called the permanent interests of the nation. And the permanent interests he defined. It's, I'm quoting it, to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. Okay? And in order to do that, you have to have power concentrated among the wealthy, and you have to have the population fragmented, and so on and so forth. And that's the way the system was set up. Okay, well, you know, there are battles about that over the centuries, and it goes up and back, and so on. But still the driving idea. What I was quoting from the Crisis of Democracy is concern about the fact that it might become a democracy. And the roots of, I mean, everything changed seriously about a century ago with what's called the corporatization of America, when new kinds of entities were established, corporate entities, which are what are called in the legal literature collectivist fictions, legal collectivist fictions, which are designed to concentrate. It was designed primarily to overcome terrible market failures and to institute some kind of command economy, but not in the hands of the state, in the hands of private power. And these entities, which are, as I said, basically totalitarian in structure, they were given the rights of persons, not by legislation, by the courts. And Adam Smith would have turned over in his grave. It was a harsh attack against classical liberalism. They got rights of persons. In the last 10 or 20 years, they've got rights way beyond persons. I mean, like if General Motors goes to Mexico, right, they can claim the rights of a Mexican. They can claim what's called national treatment. What happens to a Mexican if he happens to show up in Austin? Can he claim national treatment? I don't have to answer that. These are rights that only go to tyrannies. They don't go to people. So now they have rights way beyond people. That's only one of them. And they have tremendous power, and they're very closely linked to the powerful states and to international economic institutions, and they basically are the masters of the world. And out of that comes aggression, for just the reasons I quoted in the National Intelligence Review. You know, you want to protect commercial interests and investments, and that needs force. You have to control the growing numbers of have-nots who get disruptive and so on, and that requires force. And you have to not only have access to oil, and say in the Middle East, but you have to run it, control it, because that gives you a stupendous source of strategic power. It's veto power over others. Out of that comes aggressive behavior. But it's not human nature. You know.
Thank you.
Today, we
Two
have
more
been,
questions.
we have been discussing
one from each side. Yeah.
the high levels of economic concentration, and a good example, if not the perfect example, being the Trilateral Commission, the influence they have to dictate foreign policy and how we as Americans can counteract that with explosives.
See, I don't think the Trilateral Commission actually has influence over foreign policy. The Trilateral Commission is if you read their reports, I suggest you read them. It's mostly a horrible bore. You know, it's like reading, you know, Foreign Affairs or something like that. I mean, it's a grouping of very powerful people, and incidentally, those are the kind of liberal internationalist wing. You know, it's not the Bush guys. And they do bring together lots of powerful people, but they themselves, as an entity, they don't have any power. And it's a mistake to look for that kind of concentration of power. I mean, it's not the way the states work. They don't put power in the hands of, you know, international institutions like this.
Well, last year when they met in Washington, the overarching theme was getting in to Iraq.
When?
They met in Washington last year.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the what?
When the Trilateral Commission met?
When the Trilateral Commission met in Washington? Yeah, it was so boring, nobody even paid any attention. You know, it really is boring. Read their proceedings sometime. It's a bunch of rich guys getting together and talking about how they'd like things to happen, but they don't have any power. I mean, as the members of it do. You know, what they represent has power, okay, but not the commission itself. I think we at least my feeling is we mislead ourselves when we look at Trilateral Commission and Bilderberg and those things. Those are places where rich guys go to have their grown-up frat parties, you know.
Chin chin. Over here, and this will be our last. First, I'd like to point out that several European news agencies have reported before 9/11 that U.S. was planning some sort of action for Afghanistan, regardless of what was going to happen.
They were going to bomb Afghanistan one way or another.
Or something.
Yeah, maybe.
But my question is, I'd like to know what you think about why, at least I haven't seen anything very, by the U.S., like the U.S. government's stance on what North Korea has just said about its defiance of basically all negotiations previous.
Well, you know, the business about plans to bomb Afghanistan is probably true, but they have plans for everything. I mean, look, they've got plans to invade Canada. You know, they were actually reported in scholarly work a little while back, and that's the job. You know, the job of the planners in the Pentagon is to plan to invade everybody, and the same is true of other governments. That's what you're paid for. So you have contingency plans for anything, including invading Canada. So yeah, they probably had plans to invade Afghanistan. Doesn't mean anybody took it seriously. In retrospect, you can sort of make up a story about it, but I don't think we have any evidence that they were thinking about it. As far as North Korea is concerned, I mean, you know, we have to ask ourselves what's happening. First of all, there's a question about what we ought to be doing. I'm going to tell you my opinion. I think we ought to be following the lead of the South Koreans. They're the ones who really have something at stake. Okay, let them decide. What they're saying is let's overcome this through negotiations and move on to integration. So, you know, I think the Koreans ought to have some voice in what happens in Korea, okay? And they have a government, and it's more or less democratic as much as ours is, and so, yeah, there's a natural way to go. Why did the North Koreans make this announcement right now? You know, it's pretty hard to penetrate the minds of totalitarian dictators, but chances are that they're doing pretty much what has been predicted by American political scientists. I mean, leading U.S. political scientists have been pointing out for some time, I'll quote those of you who know the literature, Kenneth Waltz, just a couple months ago. He's one of the main international relations specialists, you know, very respected and serious. He pointed out that the U.S. is forcing countries to develop weapons of mass destruction because they have no other way of deterring U.S. power. They know that conventional means won't work. They're frightened properly. They know that they're under threat of attack. And the only thing they can do is develop weapons of mass destruction. Actually, there's something else they can do too, and that is to proliferate terrorists.
Well, why haven't we seen a strong reaction from our government?
Because, you know, they don't care that much.
Really?
I mean, North Korea is not going to use nuclear weapons.
Right.
They don't really care that much. I mean, and they probably understand it. You know, they probably understand that it's an effort at deterrence by a kind of a crazed totalitarian regime, and maybe it's maybe it's being offered as a bargaining chip for more aid or something like that. Any more than they care about Saddam Hussein. I mean, you think the guys in Washington are more stupid than people in Kuwait? I mean, if people in Kuwait and Iran aren't afraid of, I mean, they hate Saddam, you know, nobody they hate more in the world, but they're not afraid of him. I mean, why? You know, I mean, just try to imagine a scenario in which Saddam would use nuclear weapons if he even had them, which he doesn't. I mean, just imagine a scenario. If he made a move, you know, I mean, look, weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons are the main weapons of mass destruction by overwhelming margin, and nobody claims he has them. But they are of no use for anything unless people know that you have them. Like if I have nuclear weapons stored in my garage, they're of no use for threatening anybody or deterrence unless somebody knows I have them, right? So therefore, if he was ever planning to do anything with them, they'd have to make public that he has them. Okay, the instant that happens, Iraq gets obliterated, okay? I mean, if he moved a soldier toward the border, goodbye Iraq, you know? I mean, that's why nobody's afraid. There's an effort to conjure up fear here, but for other reasons, because they're dead set on a war and they want to divert people away from what's going on here and they want to take over those resources. It's got nothing to do with nuclear weapons. In fact, if they care, just think it through for a second. Suppose that anybody really took seriously what they're saying. Okay, let's believe it for a moment. Suppose that Saddam Hussein is developing weapons of mass destruction and we got to get rid of him, we got to destroy him and destroy, not just hold him back with inspectors, but destroy him and get rid of the weapons of mass destruction and gain access to Iraqi oil. A really trivial way to do it, which isn't discussed. And we could ask why. It's a lunatic idea. I'm not suggesting it. But it's less lunatic than what's being proposed, and it's never discussed, and it would answer all these problems in no time. Encourage Iran to invade Iraq. Okay? Encourage Iran to invade Iraq if they need any help, you know, give them some logistic help and maybe bomb from a distance or something. Perfect solution. I mean, if Iran takes over Iraq, they'll tear Saddam Hussein to shreds. They hate him. They'll destroy every weapon of mass destruction, not only of his, but of any successor regime, because it's the main thing that they're scared of. There won't be any American casualties. There won't be any Israeli casualties. They'll be happy to give the U.S. access to the oil. They have much better credentials than we do. Remember, the guys in Washington were supporting Saddam Hussein right through his worst atrocities, right past everything they're now accusing him of, like gassing Kurds and stuff. They continue to support him and provide him with weapons of mass destruction. You obviously can't trust those guys. That's like trusting Saddam Hussein. On the other hand, the Iranians have perfect credentials. They were his victims. The UN isn't going to be any problem, you know. There won't be terrorists. It won't inspire terrorist attacks in the West the way the CIA is predicting. So what's the matter with it? I mean, this is a perfect solution. Why doesn't anybody talk about it? You know, the reason they don't talk about it is that the proposed reasons are irrelevant. I mean, there's a downside to this. It wouldn't leave the U.S. in control of Iraq's resources. It wouldn't be able to break up OPEC and set production and price levels. Wouldn't give the U.S. a lever of world control. It wouldn't divert the American population from the attack against them that's being carried out by the Bush administration. So it's of no use. And therefore, you don't see one commentator ever suggest it, although it's the obvious answer. If you really take the argument seriously, it's a trivial way out, perfect way out. But nobody will mention it because nobody takes the argument seriously. I mean, you don't have to even refute them. They don't take them seriously themselves. If they did, that's exactly what they'd be calling for. So there's other reasons, and the other reasons are, you know, what we can figure out.
All right. Thank you.